Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with me. Today we're tackling something that I think we can all relate to, and that's those pesky wandering thoughts. The ones that always seem to pop up at the worst possible times, especially when we're trying to focus or, when we're trying to meditate. So we're going to be digging into some excerpts today from a text that I found all about, meditation techniques. And even if you've never meditated before, I really think there's something here for everyone, so stick around, because this deep dive is really all about getting a better understanding of how our minds work. And honestly, trust me, that's useful knowledge for anyone, anywhere, anytime. Okay, so let's unpack this concept of thought worlds. And this is a term that comes straight from our source material. And thought worlds, it's basically saying that our minds, they're like these little movie studios constantly, producing these elaborate scenarios and stories in our heads. And sometimes, it's helpful, like when you're planning a vacation or something and you start, imagining yourself on a beach with a drink in your hand. But then other times, these thought worlds can really trap us in these cycles of worry or regret or, even just like these what ifs. Think about those late night spirals, where you can't stop replaying a mistake you made or stressing about, tomorrow. Well, that's your mind stuck in a thought world. But there's good news. Meditation can help us learn to switch these thought worlds on and off, kind of like having, a mental remote control. And the best part, this skill, it isn't just for, like meditation gurus or something. Imagine being able to catch yourself when you're getting sucked into a negative thought spiral, like at work or, just in a stressful situation. That's the power of really understanding how your mind works. So if you're new to meditation, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do I even begin to control my thoughts? Well, our source offers this really simple rule, especially for beginners. And the rule is basically, if a thought isn't directly related to focusing on your breath during meditation, let it go. Sounds simple enough, right?
Yeah.
But it's really like training a puppy,
Yep.
Just gently redirecting your attention back to your breath over and over. And that's how you build that mental muscle. But what about those thoughts that feel really urgent, like work deadlines or family issues, things you can't really just ignore? Well, the text suggests acknowledging them first. Maybe even jotting them down so you can address them later. And then gently returning your focus back to the breath. It's about creating that mental space, that separation, where you're not constantly bombarded by these, intrusive thoughts. Okay, so now let's dive into some specific strategies from the text for dealing with, wandering thoughts during meditation. And these aren't just about silencing your mind completely. They actually offer some really interesting insights into how our thoughts function. So the first strategy is all about returning to the breath. The text uses a really brilliant analogy to describe this. It says, picture an inchworm with one end clinging to a leaf, which represents your breath, and the other end, waving around, searching for a new leaf to grab onto, which represents your wandering thought.
And it's saying that the sooner you recognize that your mind is starting to wander, the easier it is to gently guide it back to your breath. It's like catching that mental inchworm, before it fully crawls away and gets lost. Mm-hmm. The thing about how this applies when you're trying to focus on work and you get distracted by social media or something. Catching that mental inchworm early is key. Next up is a strategy called drawbacks of distraction. And this one is interesting because instead of just pushing the thought away, we're actually encouraged to analyze it. So ask yourself, where is this thought leading me? Is it helpful or harmful? It's really worth my time and energy, And this strategy is powerful because you start to see that link between your thoughts and your emotions. And here's where it gets really interesting, okay? The text suggests using counteracting thoughts. So for example, if you're feeling angry, instead of dwelling on the anger, try focusing on thoughts of goodwill first for yourself. And then if you can, even for the person that you're angry with.
It's like shifting gears in your mind, replacing those fiery, angry thoughts with something a little more positive, a little bit more cooling. Okay, so the third strategy is called ignore the thoughts. Now, I know this one might sound kind of impossible, really, but the text compares those distracting thoughts to those stray dogs you see wandering around, or, well, let's just say people who might not be thinking straight. The idea is that, if you give them attention, if you engage with them, they'll just keep pestering you. But if you can learn to just completely ignore them, they'll eventually lose interest and wander off. The text even goes so far as to suggest that by simply choosing where we focus our attention, we can actually strengthen or weaken certain potentials in our own experience. Pretty mind-blowing, huh? Okay, ready for strategy number 4. This one is all about relaxing the tension. And as you become more attuned to your body, you'll start to notice that holding on to a thought actually creates this slight tension somewhere in your body. It's like this little knot of energy that's fueling the thought. But what's fascinating is that if you can learn to identify that tension and gently dissolve it with your breath, the thought often disappears along with it. The text uses this great analogy of a spider on a web. It's saying that the spider is constantly sensing and addressing any disturbances in its web. And we too can become, more sensitive to those subtle vibrations in our minds and bodies and address them before they turn into, full-blown thought worlds. Think of it like developing a superpower, the ability to sense and dissolve mental tension before it takes over. And now for the fifth and final strategy, suppress the thought. And this is a bit more of a brute force approach, like bringing out the big guns when a thought just won't quit. It might involve using a meditation word or a mantra to interrupt the thought pattern, or even a physical cue like pressing your tongue to the roof of your mouth. The key takeaway here is that it's totally okay to use whatever works for you. There's no judgment in meditation, just exploration. So I know what you might be thinking. What about those really intense thoughts like anger or lust? Do these strategies even work then? That's a great question. And the text actually does touch on that. Remember that drawbacks of distraction strategy we talked about. Well, for thoughts that are fueled by anger, the text suggests that trying to focus on goodwill first for yourself and then for the person you're angry with can be surprisingly effective. I know it sounds a little too simple, but think about it for a second. When you're angry, your mind is fixated on the injustice, the hurt, But by shifting your focus to goodwill, even if it feels forced at first, you're changing the channel in your mind. You're replacing those, fiery thoughts with something a little more cooling and a little more compassionate. And for those thoughts that are driven by, let's say, attraction, the text suggests focusing on the less glamorous aspects of the human body, starting with your own, and then extending that perspective outward. Now, before you think that's totally weird, remember, the goal here is to interrupt that idealized image, that fantasy that your mind has created. It's like popping a bubble, bringing yourself back down to reality, The point is different thought patterns that might require, different approaches.
It's like having a toolbox full of different tools, and you need to choose the right one for the job. The key is to be mindful, to pay attention to how those thoughts feel in your body, and then experiment with different strategies to see what works best for you. But here's another really important insight from the text, and this one is key. Sometimes when you just can't seem to focus no matter how hard you try, it might not be restlessness that you're dealing with, but actually drowsiness. That's why sometimes our minds are just plain tired. We need to honor that. It's like trying to run a marathon on an empty stomach, to fuel your body and your mind with rest when it needs it. So before you beat yourself up for, not being able to meditate perfectly, just check in with your energy levels. Maybe what you really need is a nap or a walk in nature or just a good night's sleep. Sometimes the most skillful action is to simply give yourself permission to rest and recharge, So as we're kind of wrapping up this deep dive into taming those wandering thoughts, let's recap some of the key takeaways,
And remember, it's not about, like eradicating thoughts altogether. Our minds, they're meant to think, they're meant to create and explore. It's more about learning to manage those thoughts skillfully so they don't, completely run the show. So we've explored 5 really powerful strategies so far for dealing with those wandering thoughts, and you can think of them as tools in your mental toolbox. First, we have returning to the breath, like gently guiding that mental inchworm back to its leaf. Then there's the drawbacks of distraction, where you actually take some time to analyze those thoughts and their impact. And you can even try using counteracting thoughts to kind of shift your mental gears. Next, we have ignoring the thoughts, and this is where we treat those distractions like those pesky stray dogs that'll eventually lose interest if you just don't engage. Then we have relaxing the tension. So becoming aware of the subtle ways those thoughts are creating tension in your body, and then learning how to dissolve that tension with your breath.
And finally, there's suppress the thought, which is, the brute force approach for those really stubborn thoughts that just won't quit. And that's where we use things like mantras or physical cues to try and interrupt that thought pattern. But remember, meditation is a practice. It's not a destination. There are going to be days when your mind feels, like a calm, peaceful lake, and other days when it feels like a stormy ocean. The key is to approach the practice with, patience, kindness, and a sense of humor. And the most important takeaway of all is to just listen to your body and your mind. Sometimes the best thing you can do is to simply rest. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. I hope you found these insights, helpful and maybe even a little bit mind-blowing. But before we officially sign off, I want to leave you with something to kind of ponder. We've been talking about these thought worlds and how they can be both helpful and a bit of a trap, right? Well, challenge yourself this week to really pay attention to your own, personal thought worlds.
Notice when you get swept away by worry, or, when you're using your imagination in a really positive way. And here's the real experiment. Try out one of the strategies that we discussed today. See if you can catch those mental inchworms early, or play around with using counteracting thoughts. It's like having a secret weapon for your mind. Until next time, happy exploring your own incredible mental landscape. And that about wraps it up for today. So until next time, keep those thought worlds in check and happy exploring.